Resume recording. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, May 22nd. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to showcase this expert panel as part of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance Summer Standard Issue event series. I'm Julianne McCall. I'm the CEO and managing publisher of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, JSPG for short. And I'm joined by these three extraordinary leaders in the public policy field across academia, think tank, and nonprofit sectors. I'm also joined by a fellow JSPG staff member. Dr. Hannah Fry is our Director of Programs and Events. Before I launch into introducing our expert panelists, I wanted to take just a few minutes to provide a brief overview of JSPG, as well as our partner organization on this issue, the National Science Policy Network. So, as I mentioned, this event is the final one of a series leading up to our May 26th submission deadline for the broad, open summer standard issue. And we look forward to receiving your manuscripts shortly. For those of you unfamiliar with JSPG, we're a 501c3 nonprofit international organization that, as far as we know, is the only journal in the world dedicated to early career professionals, students, and fellows in the science and technology policy fields. We were created about 12 years ago, and we proudly serve as a vehicle for, as I mentioned, early career professionals and students to get their foot in the door in science and technology policy conversations nationally and internationally. We encourage those participants of our network to engage and contribute to the process at all levels of government, local, state, regional, national, as well as international, and are proud to be able to provide some professional development opportunities via workshops, networking events, even courses through an online certificate program. We are not able to advance my slide. Here's a few examples of the professional development opportunities. Like this one, a webinar bolstered by writing workshops, the most recent of which was held by Dr. Hannah Fry with our editor-in-chief, Andy Sanchez, as well as Anastasia Bernat from the National Science Policy Network. That is now uploaded to our YouTube channel, which you're welcome to consult at any time. We also have a number of partners from AAAS to UNESCO to the Inter-Americas Institute for Global Change Research and well beyond, who showcase our authors at summits and conferences and meetings of all sorts. A brief note about the National Science Policy Network. They are about 5 years old, the mission of which is to catalyze the engagement of early career scientists and engineers in policymaking by continuing to foster an inclusive community, by providing training opportunities and empowering advocates for the role of science in society. They were established as a grassroots organization. They have over 1,700 members, mostly at the early career stage. And they proudly offer hands-on experiences in diplomacy and science and technology policy areas. It's an entirely virtual network, but I do have to say their annual conferences are fabulous and fun. So I highly recommend engagement in that realm. To center us back on the standard issue call for submissions, which is fast approaching May 6th. The goal of this issue is to generate and amplify policy ideas. We especially encourage submissions that highlight opportunities and audiences which center justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. All manuscripts will be reviewed by our fiercely independent editorial board, composed of 35 early career professionals, students, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows over a 4-month process. The types of formats that we accept the list of which has recently been updated. So I wanted to take just a brief moment to go through the opportunities here. So from policy memos to the standard op-ed, right, up to 600 words, to 1,000-word fact sheets, technical, deep dive technical assessments, and policy analyses, workshop reports, book reviews, but we don't cut it off there. If you have another format that you'd like to submit, we are more than welcome. We're more than happy to work with you and find a place for it in the journal. In terms of who is eligible to publish in JSPG, at least half of the authors must meet one of the following criteria. I won't walk through these, but roughly within 10 years of a terminal degree or a pivot into a policy career. This seems quite expansive, but we want to be as inclusive as possible for those pursuing career tracks that are anything but linear and direct. We encourage submissions from all disciplines and professional backgrounds. You don't necessarily need to have chosen a career or a graduate program in policy to be eligible and qualified. And we also welcome partnerships with more senior individuals as co-authors, so long as the composition of the authorship team is the majority early career professionals and students. And with that, I am thrilled to begin introducing this absolute star-studded panel, a couple of which I've known for a long time, and another, Dr. Sharpe, I'm so thrilled to welcome you into the JSPG network. Let me start with Dr. Sharpe. Dr. Rhonda Vonshay Sharpe is the founder and president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, for short known as WISER. She is the co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy and served as the past president of the National Economic Association. Her research has been featured by PBS, the New York Times, and the Carrie Miller Show, and she was a recurring guest on the BBC's Business Matters show as well. Dr. Sharpe serves on the boards of several international boards. She's an Institute for Economic Equity Fellow at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. Dr. Sharpe also completed her graduate studies in mathematics at North Carolina Wesleyan College, as well as her doctorate in economics mathematics at Claremont Graduate University in California, where I'm currently sitting. Dr. Sharpe, thank you so much for joining us. I think I might go through all the introductions and then hand it over to the panel to provide further brief get into some richer detail into your backgrounds. So next on our panel is Ms. Anjali Sarker. She is the program director of the Global Leadership Challenge based at the University of Oxford, where she leads a wide range of leadership and character development programs for both students and professionals. Her work in higher education focuses on leadership, innovation, and human development, where she's a deep believer that everyone has the potential to be a leader, and character is essential for good, powerful leadership. Trained as an international development practitioner, she previously worked at BRAC, one of the largest non-governmental organizations in the world, primarily to bring digital financial services to 1 million women in Bangladesh. She is also a Senior Atlantic Fellow at the London School of Economics, a Dalai Lama Fellow, a New Voices Fellow at the Aspen Institute, and a former Global Shaper at the World Economic Forum. She holds an MBA from Said Business School, a master's in science degree in inequalities from the London School of Economics, as well as a diploma in social innovation from Lund University in Sweden, and a bachelor's degree from the Institute for Business Administration in Dhaka. Thank you so much, Anjali, for joining us, and I look forward to your opening remarks as well. To conclude our introductions here, I'm equally thrilled to introduce my good friend, Dr. Meron Tesfaye. She's a senior policy analyst at the Energy for Growth Hub. Before joining, she worked as a senior policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., focusing on various aspects of U.S. clean energy policy, including clean hydrogen, industrial decarbonization, biomass, clean fuels, and a number of other topics, always with an environmental justice lens. Previously, Dr. Tesfaye was a senior policy fellow at Carbon 180, developing equitable federal policies for carbon removal and climate mitigation technologies. She also served as a science fellow in the California Senate Budget Committee. She holds a doctoral degree in chemical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering with a minor in engineering leadership development from the University of Maryland at College Park. Dr. Tesfaye leverages her science training and policy background to advance clean energy solutions and expand energy access in emerging communities. And like with her fellow panelists here, right, has generously carved out an hour of her very busy calendar to be able to join you all in bringing you into this into these worlds of positive and equitable change. And I am absolutely thrilled to now finally hand the microphone to you, Dr. Sharpe, to get us started with some brief remarks, where I would love to for you to be able to share a little bit more about your background. Oh, where am I? Sorry. A little bit more about your background, and if you could provide an example of where you've seen public policy succeed, particularly for with an equitable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. So a little bit more about my background. I'd like to say that I am a recovering academic. I spent 16 years as an econ, and people don't. Yeah. And started the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. So I'm gonna I think that's pretty much like the bulk of my background. I've spent a lot of time being associated with programs that are directed at increasing the economics pipeline, in particular folks who have or are interested in getting a PhD in economics. I served as the associate director for the American Economics Association summer program, which will celebrate its 50th anniversary this year, not necessarily 50 cohorts, but it was established in 1974. First site to host the program was Berkeley, so that'll happen in about 3 weeks, June 14th, 15th, at the first historically Black college to host. With William Sandy Darity, who is at Duke, we created the Diversity Initiative Economics, which is geared towards folks in economics. Diversity defined broadly, so people get to tell us why they diversify the profession. And we did that in 2008. I stepped down as the associate director in 2000. And most recently, in a partnership with Howard's economics department, Weiser hosts something called the Inclusive Peer On-Site Distance Mentoring Program, which is modeled after a medical physicians training program, in which we bring in students who have participated in the program at Howard, give them 3 years of professional development support, providing prep. We give them money for PhD programs, and essentially, anything else that they can tell us that they need that will make them more competitive towards the PhD. So that's the work that I've done. I think there are 2 policy initiatives that I'm most excited about that have come up in the last 2 to 3 years, and one is the framework for federal scientific integrity policy and practice, having a firm definition about what scientific integrity is. And I have these on the slide that I'll share with you later. And one is scientific integrity is the adherence to professional practices, ethical behavior, and the principles of honesty and objectivity when conducting, managing, using the results of, and communicating about science and scientific activities. Inclusivity, transparency, and protection from inappropriate influence are hallmarks of scientific integrity. And the reason that I am excited about this particular statement is, I think, as the US becomes more diverse, defined broadly, both race, gender, we're having more conversation about the class divide, which means in many ways we have less economic diversity and therefore potentially a larger underclass that can be taken advantage of in a variety of ways. I like this policy because I like to think that what it means is that when people are conducting research and when they're thinking about the results of that they will be mindful not to take advantage of vulnerable groups, both in the process of the research and will be mindful of the ways that they actually talk about them when they're disseminating research. The second policy that I am excited about because it is very dear to my heart is Section 9 of the Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the federal government, which was Biden's executive order that came out in his first day in office. And it talks about establishing an equitable data working group. It goes on to say many federal databases are not disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, or other key demographic variables. The lack of data has cascading effects and impedes effort to measure and advance equity. A first step to promoting equity in government action is to gather data necessary to inform that effort. That is dear to my heart, and that at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, we advocate for the disaggregation of data, primarily because inequality hides in the aggregate. So all of us can remember from our stats classes, when you're talking about the mean, it's the highs and the lows. And so when you disaggregate data, and we advocate not in the banal sense, we want people to disaggregate data by the characteristics believed to influence an outcome, that when you do that, you'll get to see the nuances in outcomes. So you can really see things like who's being left behind, what are the characteristics that are influencing outcomes. And then I'd like to be optimistic that when we do that, it allows us to craft policies that are far more effective to eradicating what inequality. It's a little bit about me and the two policies that I am most excited about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharpe. It's a real honor to have you with us today, and thank you for providing us a richer window into that world in which you are making positive change. I'll pass it now to Ms. Sarker for your additional opening remarks. Right, pardon me, Rhonda, thank you so much for making that comment. And Anjali, we'll go first name basis from here on out, a little more friendly. Anjali, would love to know a little bit more about your background, how your work at BRAC and so many other connections have painted your role in addressing inequalities through leadership and otherwise.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and you were super generous in talking about all the wonderful things in our bios. I think when I'm going to talk about myself now, probably I should talk about the failures because, we don't write those in our CVs. They are not on our LinkedIn profiles, but those experiences shape us, as leaders, as human beings. So my career really started as a social entrepreneur. And as Rhonda said, she's a recovering academic. I'm a recovering social entrepreneur. I failed miserably. I think I had really big dreams and ambitions, how my idea, my with a capital M, my idea, my big thing can change the world. But when we are talking about justice, equality, when we are talking about very deeply rooted systemic problems, the challenges are so complex. They are so intertwined with each other. It's quite arrogant, I would say, to think that, oh, I can go out and I can make this massive difference very quickly, almost overnight. So I think my initial experience in the social landscape when I was trying to establish my own social enterprise and failed, as I said, miserably after a few years. So that made me very humble. That made me think a lot about, okay, what does equality really mean? And throughout my career till this point, I think if despite working across different sectors and currently working in academia, I feel that essentially what I have been trying to do for the last, 10, 12, 14 years is opening doors for people. because some doors are locked for a huge number of people around the world. Depending on who you are, how you look, where you are coming from, some doors can remain closed to you forever. So I feel that policy could be an excellent tool there. And that's what obviously I can give you probably more examples of failed policies rather than, policies that I admire and that has been successful in creating equitable societies. But it could be a fantastic tool. And just talking about, again, I would like to remain optimistic. I still am, but just to share a couple of different examples that I admire from the policy space. So one particular example, because previously when I was working in Bangladesh, my work was very focused on digital financial inclusion for women. And this is a complex space because many people, and especially people who come to the space with a lot of money, quote unquote donors, people who are not living in the context, people who are, let's say, living in New York and making the decision for a woman in a remote village in Bangladesh. So people who are detached from the realities, often they come with great theoretical ideas, but they do not understand that technology can only solve probably half of the problem, if not less. They forget the human part of it. So a simple example could be, you think that, okay, here's a poor woman, she doesn't have money, let's give her money. You don't think about the relationship, the complex relationship she has with her husband. And even if she has money, she will not be the one deciding how to spend the money. So just making sure that the money reaches the people you want to reach, that does not really solve the problem. Often that creates more problems. Like in the space of financial inclusion, we have seen many times, okay, now women have mobile phones and they have the bank account in their phones, everything seems perfect, but their husbands and their family members are abusing them, because now the husband thinks, you are sending money to your parents without telling me. Now you have your own phone and you can do whatever you want. So I think in the policies where I have seen real success, they didn't only think about the technical aspect of the policy, they also thought about how this is connected to the social landscape, how this is connected to the culture, the norms, all the underlying invisible barriers, discrimination, biases that make societies, what they are. When when the policymakers take that into account and create something that is digital, true, that has the technology, but it also addresses the human aspect. So many of the digital financial inclusion policies we currently have in Bangladesh, and again, they are not perfect, we have a long way to go, but they take the gender lens into account. And this is partly due to the strong involvement that the non-government organizations, different advocacy bodies, different forums, people who are in the third sector, quote unquote, how they engage with the government, how they engage with the policymakers. It is a complex process. And as I said, things are not perfect, but they have a say. Historically, Bangladesh has been a very fertile ground for this kind of collaboration, where this is not just the government, this is not just the donors or just the social sector NGO folks. It's a collaboration. It's a collaboration where people have different pieces of the solution, and we acknowledge that we don't have it all. We don't know it all. We need to talk to each other. No one can do it alone. So that is one aspect I really admire about, creating technology policies, but we have to see the human side of it. We cannot take human out of the picture and think, here's my technology, here's the policy, that is it. It's going to change the world or solve the problem. So I feel that, and bringing it back to the current work I do here at the University of Oxford. Here, my role is essentially supporting future policymakers and leaders to become good leaders. So many of the topics that we talk about when we talk to our students, and they are doing wonderful things. They are doing their PhDs. They are going to be incredible scientists and engineers, doctors, and whatnot. But we request them to be humble. We request them to ask good questions, be open to different worldviews, because we believe that who you are, what you have been exposed to, that shape how you lead. And no matter whether you are the smartest person in the world, many might think so, no matter who you are and how intelligent you are, or what might be your academic credentials, you are dealing with a person, you are going to deal with communities who are just different from you. Their stories are different, and you don't know that. And unless you are humble enough to take a step back and ask, okay, I'm curious to know, why do you do things in a certain way? What makes you say something? What makes you behave in a certain way? Unless you have that humility and come with an open mind, you are going to impose your solution on people, and they are going to bear the consequences for long after you have left the place. And that is something we have seen in development world again and again, and probably we will keep seeing that, God knows for how long. But I think a little more humility could do a lot of good to policymakers, to future leaders, to scientists, to everyone. I don't know how much time I'm taking, so I'll stop here. I talk too much when I'm passionate.
You are in such good company, and Anjali, we could listen to you for hours without complaint. But thank you very much for providing that nutshell view into your world, and right to touch on this reckoning of, if you really want to be advanced with your research and your analyses, right, it goes far beyond the technical into the real world settings, right, to accommodate the social drivers of advancement and connection and progress. So thank you so much for providing us this teaser. I look forward to the discussion. To round out our welcoming remarks, I wanted to pass it now to you, Meron, to provide a little more depth to your role in the policymaking machine, and an example of where you've seen equity injected into policymaking.
Yeah, thanks so much for putting me on this panel. Like I'm over here getting my own inspiration, so this is duly beneficial. I always appreciate you, Julianne. You're always connecting people, so I'm really grateful for you. I I hope you all can hear me. This is like the first time I'm using these AirPods, so good. Okay. Yeah, so I like to say that I'm I think we're all on the spectrum of recovering from academia. But I like to at least highlight also, like, as a scientist, like I have a lot of enthusiasm for policy, like especially as someone who was trained in engineering. I think the collaborative and the iterative aspects of policymaking are undervalued or not seen as well as things are in engineering. I mean, there's just so much in engineering that you start small and you build a coalition and you bring in different ideas. And similar in policy, like there's so much iteration that happens, and every person that touches a policy idea refines it, makes it better. And especially if those people who touch it are like most directly impacted by those policies, then that brings even better policy solutions. So I think from that sense, like I see so many similarities between my background and what I'm doing now. So I like to say I'm a scientist turned policy enthusiast. And obviously I share a similar background to Julianne, where I took a science policy fellowship to transition into policy work. But my focus has always been, even prior to my graduate work, has always been energy issues, and energy issues that, particularly having grown up in Ethiopia, that I felt were so obvious and so clear. We had severe power outages. Energy access was the reason why we couldn't do our homework at a certain time. We didn't have access to internet, and a lot of those things are definitely changing now, but they're still not changing quite as fast as one would hope. So like that's sort of, I guess, the personal lens that has informed my path. But talking about failures and taking a non-linear path, I think even getting to this point, I currently do work on energy issues, primarily targeting emerging and growing economies like my home country in Ethiopia. But the path wasn't clear. I think I said I wanted to do it like maybe 10, 13 years ago, but first I took the research route and then I took the state route, and it was a very much convoluted path. And I'm a firm believer that like each steps that we take kind of adds up. And so I think it's kind of actually like awesome to look back and see how all of those things have contributed to getting me to this space. So I think that's sort of the personal side of it, and definitely happy to talk more in the Q&A. But from a policy standpoint, I might give just like hopefully quick two examples. One from my former role looking at federal policies in the climate and energy, US federal policies in the climate and energy space. And then also policy effort that I'm working on or contributing to now in my current role at the Energy for Growth Hub. So talking about the US federal policy, obviously, energy impacts and climate impacts are not equally distributed. They impact low-income communities differently. They impact communities of color because of our historical inequities that are sort of built into the US system. And one sort of, I'm just mentioning one example, but there are many. But one thing, so that we, a coalition, I don't even want to say we, but it's a coalition of effort, but that we tried to do was, for example, in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a sort of a seminal legislation that was passed a year and a half ago. A lot of coalition and a lot of effort went into including this definition called energy communities. And these are communities that are impacted by fossil fuel and communities that are impacted by job losses. And we've also included low-income community definition. So basically, the bill contains like additional bonus credit for these communities. So if a renewable energy developer wants to basically invest in those communities, they would get an additional credit. So this is kind of the carrot, like that's why some of these, definitions of what do we mean, who are we targeting, how what's policy targeting really matters, is because it really directs the investments to those communities as well. So that's sort of one example I wanted to give, in that like we can design policies to target folks who are most impacted by either historical disinvestment or current lacking infrastructure. And then from, again, my current role, I've only been at it for 2.5 months. So just going to give you a very small glimpse, since I'm still sort of figuring out my path here. But we really focus on how emerging economies are faring. So we think high energy or abundant energy is necessary for economic growth, and it enables so many things. And if folks are familiar with what we call a sustainable development goals, one of those global sustainable development goals is that there is a minimum, an energy minimum, and that energy minimum right now is set to 50 to 100 kilowatt hour per person. And that is a very low threshold. So if I were to use my refrigerator, that's 500 kilowatts per hour per person. It's not, we have some standards that are far for countries that are far lower than the equipments and then the products that we use even in the household. So one thing in the policy framework that we try to work on at the hub is how do we elevate that minimum energy so that we can enable more prosperous and more productive societies both at home but also externally, because as folks go out and produce goods and products, they also consume energy, and we need to envision a world that is encompassing that high energy. And I will stop there.
Meron, thank you so much. I really appreciate you providing, right, a taste of, right, what you and your colleagues are regularly addressing within the energy and environmental justice fields. So I am now delighted to hand it over to the full panel to help, right, our community of students, early career professionals, right, curious about having an impact via science and technology, policy, and governance. Submitting articles is one thing, right? But actually advocating for those ideas is an entirely different beast. So I would love, right, in, probably maybe a few minutes each, right, for you to provide, right, a little more flavor, right, a little more depth to what does it take, right, from the concept itself. Anjali, you started to touch on this a little bit of, having that theoretical, that technical solution is one thing, right, but actually bringing that, progressing that idea through to outcome and impact is an entirely another track. So perhaps Rhonda, starting with you and then going through the panel, I would love to know a little bit more of your thoughts on that advocacy aspect, and if you want to start touching on, right, the gaps, right, and how we might be able to fill those gaps moving forward. Would love to know your thoughts.
Thank you. So I am going to start with something that Anjali said, and that is that she said she was arrogant. And I want to encourage her and others to flip that to being confident. And I think that is the first thing that we need, and that is to be confident that your perspective matters. She talked about being a failed social entrepreneur, and we want to be mindful that in those failures, as Meron, am I saying that correctly? As Meron said, that all of those experiences make you better in the spaces that you eventually end up in. So I would say what's important for advocacy is to know that, to be confident that what you are thinking and that what you want to say matters. And while in every space you may not be heard, and I'll put that in quotation marks, people will hear you and they will welcome that difference of opinions when you're walking in space. And I'm going to really encourage you not to entertain this notion of imposter syndrome. Right? Please do not entertain that. Know that all of us come with a varying level of experiences, and it does not mean that you're an imposter for being in a space. And that if you remember that, first of all, whoever invited you thinks that you have value to be on that panel, that should erase your imposter syndrome, and then be confident in what it is that you're saying. I think the second thing that I would say that is important for advocacy work is following up on what Meron said, and that is definitions. That you are mindful in the ways that words function, like things like women and minorities. Who are the women? And they generally are not any of the women that are being spotlighted right now. It is white women, yet people will not put that adjective in front. When we say people of color, make sure they literally mean people of color, and that's not a euphemism for a Black community. Right? If it's a Black community, then you need to ask people to define and name that it is a Black community and not people of color, because all people of color do not have the same experience with any particular lived experience, right? It's not going to be the same outcome. So as we're thinking about definitions, be confident to ask, excuse me, so you said people of color, who are you actually talking about? We say low income, and often think we forget that in that advocacy for low income, this is the ways in which policy advocates can include poor whites who outnumber any of us who are thought to be marginalized groups, especially under that title of people of color, that the largest population of low income folks are going to be white. So I'm going to wrap that up and say, be confident in spaces. That should take care of anything you have about imposter syndrome. Challenge definitions and speak up. If we are not, and this again is going on what Anjali said about the humility and realizing that technology on its own won't get it done. Well, the thing that we often forget about technology is that humans are creating the technology and we bring our biases into those spaces. Right. And so if you recognize that humans created the technology, therefore often technology is going to have its own bias built in, you have to walk in spaces and challenge and question. And not in an obnoxious way, but and I don't know if I'm going to say in a humble way either, right? I'm not sure. I need you to, to kind of walk into space and be very confident and know that when you're asking a question, that it is really a question that needs for someone to be defined and not to shrink in your intelligence and your training, because someone may be asking you to be humble, right? And again, I understand your point about humility, but I think often I think the only people we really ask to be humble are folks who are not white males, and we want to be mindful of that, right? That's rare that we're asking them to be humble. So I want the humility in terms of being open to different perspectives, but not in a way that requires you to shrink in any way. And then I think the last thing is use social media for good. Right? I think there are lots of ways that you can be on Twitter and you can be on Instagram, and you don't necessarily have to do videos, but there can be items that come out in which you voice your opinions about them and also know the difference in those spaces. I think Twitter is the space where you can challenge. That is not LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn is the place that you go to say, hey, I was this place, and this is what I think and how wonderful it was, but you cannot challenge in LinkedIn. I think Instagram and Twitter are spaces that you can challenge and know that when you challenge, that people will be watching. And a lot of opportunities can come because you are asking people to think about what they're saying and the actions that they're doing. So those are sort of my thought. And I think the gap is that we're not asking people to define, and we are not thinking about the ways that we use data, and we are allowing narratives to continue that are harmful, and we're not asking people to take a step back from the harmful narratives that they are perpetuating.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Anjali or Meron, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I can go next. That was very practical, very helpful. And definitely, I think as people of color, often we confuse humility and modesty. I am not telling people to be modest. If you have done something, own it. Doesn't matter who you are, how you look, where you are sitting, even if you don't have a seat at the table. If you have something, own it by all means. I just want to offer a couple of questions that I feel people should ask themselves. One of them is, are you doing enough? And again, I ask this question to my students, to myself very often. All of us, with the education that we have, with the positions that we own, with the circles that we have, yes, we do have problems, we have limitations, we have challenges. There will be more in the future, but still, compared to many people who I worked with and I worked for, honestly, just the fact that I am here on Zoom, speaking in English, talking to an audience who also understand me in English, that puts me above. I don't even want to estimate the percentage, above many communities in the world. Just being able to express myself in English, that is a privilege. Again, I'm not probably, using the right definition of privilege here, but I hope you understand my point. I have a platform. I have a LinkedIn account. That's a platform. Not everyone, not everyone has it. So just looking at the higher education institutions we are part of, looking at the scientific communities we talk to, looking at people who will listen to us if we say something, I feel that we really have enormous privilege. So are we doing enough? Are we doing enough to use it? Are we doing enough to put public good above personal gain? Because often, and this is what I see among students and very bright, very ambitious students, who can only think about, okay, what do I want? How do I get the next job? How do I publish the next paper? How do I get whatever? You name it. How do I get X? Which is fine. That's personal ambition, that's fine, but what about the good? What about the greater good? What about other people? What about all the people who contributed in countless ways? What about people who sacrificed so that you can be here where you are? So when we are busy pursuing our personal ambitions and goals, no problem in doing that. At the same time, we should not forget about others. We should not forget about we have a responsibility. We have our influence, and we should use it to champion public good and not just pursue personal gain. And probably on a lighter note, I find, this question does not really have a good answer, but I enjoy thinking about this. What will be your gift to the world? Because sometimes we focus probably too much on ourselves and the goals we set for ourselves. And again, that's all good and great, but what am I going to leave, for my communities, for my people? Because I work in a leadership space. One question that I find fascinating, I probably am throwing too many questions, but why lead? Why bother leading? Why bother coming to the panel and talking to people? There better be a good answer. Why are we taking this burden, a joyful burden of leadership? Why are we trying to promote advocacy? Why are we even bothering to, talk to people who perhaps don't want to listen to us? So I feel if we find that answer, that will keep us going, even when people are not willing to listen to us, even when people are not willing to give us a seat at the table. So this is an encouragement, an invitation to find that answer. Like, why are you, bothering to do this painful thing, whatever thing that you are advocating for? And probably that will serve you for a long time.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Meron, would you like to spend a minute or two? I do want to get to our audience question right after, but would love for your thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what was already said, and appreciate the nuance between modesty and humility. I think it's a valuable thing to underscore. I think it's worth, especially as a scientist, like the thing I'm constantly sort of challenged by is remembering that I come with my own biases and with my own sort of overwhelming narratives that has been reinforced for a long time, and it's important to sometimes question those things and see how some of those narratives can trump people's material needs, and be sort of like put yourself sort of in that question as well, and evaluate how you are positively or negatively impacting that situation. And we see that not just on a like personal scale, but especially in the climate space. This is a constant tension, especially for developing economies, because the wealthy countries are so focused on carbon intensity that we often forget that developing economies have interest in growth, have and that can block certain aspirations that those countries have. And so how does that overwhelming narrative that we have internally or within our country, how does that limit the ambition or the desire that those countries have for others. So and these are built in with our education, with the things that we read. So it's important to sometimes question those underlying narratives as scientists and policymakers.
Julianne, can I
Fantastic.
just add one thing before we
Absolutely.
go? And that is the table. Aligning with the practical advice is to remind young scholars that because of Zoom, Teams, and a variety of ways that you can do webinars, you can create your own table. You don't have to wait for invitations. You can invite the people that you want to, theoretically, it won't be diverse if you all think the same, but you can invite the people whose voices you want to amplify, and then invite all the other people who never invited you to sort of say, here are the ways that you are missing. We have something to say, and here's a platform that we're using to do that. So just want to remind folks that in this world of Zoom and sort of video conferencing, you can create your own table and invite the people that you want to amplify, and then post it and share it so that you don't have to wait for the invitation.
Thank you so much for emphasizing that point. I couldn't agree more. I'm delighted to turn it over to Disha Patel to interact with the panel directly. Disha, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Disha, and I'm a second-year graduate student in biochemistry. My question is, what are some ways that a trainee in science can gain more exposure in science policy and discussions, and also gain the confidence to engage in that discussion, especially when you're just starting out?
I'll just quickly start and say, I think it's important to know like what matters to you, and then start like investing in that, and that may be in areas that are formal or non-formal, but really it's really I think there's so much of our personality and personal narratives that are part of our scientific and policy training, and just our in general personhood. So I think it's important to recognize that and start investing those, whether that looks like being part of different networks on campus, whether that means like joining social movements, whether that means designing different courses that you want to teach, as like there's so many things that it could encompass, and I don't want to be prescriptive, but I think it's about responding to where's sort of that overlap between your training and your personal passions, and how can you use the current space that you are in to advance that.
Rhonda and Anjali, I know we have only a few minutes left, but if you'd like to respond as well, I know that Disha would appreciate your thoughts too.
So I would say to you, very cliche, right? Be the change you want. So following up what Meron said, all of the things that you want, you can create and bring your peers to. And then if you are working with senior folks and there are conferences coming up that you want to attend, and this is something that I tell econ folks, most of us who are senior do not want to fill out the paperwork to attend a conference. We don't want to write that abstract. We don't want to submit the work. And a lot of times we don't want to go to the conference. And so I think that is, if you will take on like, hey, I saw this conference, I think it's a great place for our work, submit, and then say, oh, and I'd be happy to go out and present. I think what we forget is when we are in spaces and we see young folks out presenting, folks will be like, oh my gosh, and you're just the second year and you understand X, Y, and Z, and you're doing that. All of that are opportunities, one, for you to build your network, and the praise that you get from being in the space this young and doing a fantastic job, I think are ways in which you boost your confidence. When I think about young scholars, I do that. Like I try to get them in those spaces, because I think about comedians and musicians, and they're all like, the first time I heard the applause, I was like, wait, that's for me? Like, yes, this is what I want to do for the, like the rest of my life. And I think the same is for many of us when we're in spaces and people are like, that was fantastic. You did a fabulous job. those are the things that help build confidence. So I'd encourage you to take lead on projects, because I assure you, your senior person does not want to fill out the paperwork for that.
If it feels scary or too big or too daunting, I strongly recommend starting small. Give it a try. If not the full thing, just a small part. If not alone, with a friend, with someone who's maybe a year older than you. So I feel that often I have been in many discussions, again, being the junior most person, or worse, being the only person of color, being the only woman. And those rooms, I mean, trust me, no one saw me. It's like you are in a room, full of whoever, but you are kind of invisible, right? And I know practically it can feel really, really lonely. And I'm just being very practical and what I have experienced in the past. You might feel demotivated, but the point is, I will give you a star simply because you were there in the room. And it's not going to be your last room, because I was there in my first room. I thought, okay, fine, you don't care, fine, I'll show up again. Okay, fine, you didn't pay attention to my question, I'll ask again. And you said, no, okay, fine, I'll ask one more time. Again, no, it doesn't cost money, right? So I feel that start small and do it again. And then one more time. You will be surprised that people will start noticing you, even if they don't pay attention in the beginning. So they will, but yeah, just hang in there.
Thank you so much, Disha. Thank you for the confidence to pose a question to our illustrious panel. We really appreciate the voice of our audience here. To our panelists, we have just the briefest 2 minutes if you wanted to provide a 20-second nutshell version of closing remarks. Any additional thoughts you'd like to share for our audience of JSPG and NSPN potential authors?
I often hear people talk about the isolation and the loneliness. My phone popped up a couple of weeks ago that's on May 16th, and it said 25th anniversary of your PhD. And I was like, ooh, right? Like a quarter of a century. I am a Black woman. I have always been in math and science. So when I hear people talk about the loneliness, this is not always something that I identify with. And I think some of that for me has been my outside community, so that my friends are not necessarily in the space, but have always been encouraging. And I would say to you, when you're in a space, people hear you. They hear you. They hear you. And I would encourage, all of us to be mindful. No, they just because they didn't acknowledge what you said doesn't mean that they didn't hear you. And if you pay attention to them, you may see the subtle ways in which what you've said is going to influence their behavior. So, and I will also say, we are not invisible in the room. We're not. There's no way that we can be invisible in the room. So I would say that if you feel invisible, you should ask yourself, why is it that you feel invisible? Because if you're brown in a sea of white, there is no way you are invisible in that room, right? So you should ask yourself, is this something that you've heard repeatedly, that these are what these spaces are, and therefore you're invisible? Because the reality is you're not invisible. So be mindful of the biases that you're bringing into these spaces, that they're not going to hear you and they're not going to be welcoming, because that also shapes your experience. I was saying to someone today about imposter syndrome, and that when I was a postdoc, Sandy Darity had me on a panel with 3 endowed professors, and I was doing the Sesame Street thing. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things does not belong. Like, that was playing in my head. And I asked him, why was I there? And it was because they need to hear what you have to say. And I am mindful of that when I go into spaces, that I am here because you need to hear what I'm going to say. And I heard a Black male say recently that he never worries about anybody saying what he was going to say. And I was like, really? Because I feel that way, right? Because my lived experiences aren't similar. So there's no way we're going to say the same thing. And he said, yes. So my 2 cents on that one, we're not invisible. right? Because there's no way we can be. And two, ask yourself, are you entering a room with biases that are going to influence the way that you operate in that room that actually may not be true? So, those are sort of my two things to think about.
Thank you, Rhonda, for a battle cry to get in there. Anjali, would you like to share brief closing remarks?
Few remarks. Number one, Disha, and anyone else who's listening to this, write to Rhonda, have her as your mentor. This will serve you big time, I'm telling you. That's number one. And number two, again, I'm sure you are in the space because you love what you do, you enjoy science. Never lose that feeling, never lose that innocent, beautiful love or whatever you feel about whatever it is that you are studying or researching. When times will be tough, and there probably will be tough times, that love will keep you going. That love will give you a reason to try again. So never let go of that little, whatever innocent thing that you have in your heart. Preserve it.
Thank you, Anjali. Meron?
I'm terrified to follow those advices because those were excellent. Just want to say ditto. And definitely agree that imposter syndrome is sometimes sort of internal, and definitely it's a personal battle that I also feel constantly. I will say something that does help me kind of at least defocus the imposter syndrome as I'm working on getting rid of it is thinking about who am I serving right now, and who do I want to be in service of. And I think that sort of reframes it from a me question to an outward question, and how do I want to use my time. And I find that to be a very helpful answer. Sometimes the answer is not good. Maybe it reveals something I need to change, but it is definitely a good thing to be engaging with on a semi-constant basis.
Wonderful. Well, I want to take a moment to remind our participants here that this recording will be published on our YouTube channel. You are also more than welcome to engage with us on our social media channels. I want to thank our panelists once more for just an extraordinary show of support of this community of early career professionals, students, and fellows. You truly give me such hope for the world to have your leadership helping to guide these conversations, programs, and investments. So thank you very, very much. I'm also grateful to the National Science Policy Network for partnering with JSPG on our summer standard issue. And with that, I will conclude our expert panel here, and I look forward to engaging with you further on another platform. Thank you, everyone.